Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is episode 84 of season 2. This is part 2 of the Maratha years. In part 1, both Shahaji Bhonsle and his son Sambhaji had died, and now the seat of the Jagir passed on to Shahaji's son Ekoji in 1664, and that is where we begin today. Because the decade and a half that followed was, for Bengaluru, one of the most turbulent in its histories, caught between three adversaries simultaneously, each of them formidable, none of them sympathetic. But before I move on, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, whose support makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Few rulers in history have had to face as much trouble on as many fronts as Ekoji Bhonsle did in the decade and a half between 1674 and 1687. History tends to look at events of a timeline separately, but when you lay the timelines together, what you see is a man besieged not by one adversary. There was Aurangzeb pressing south all the way from Delhi. There was his own brother Shivaji pressing east from Raigad, and Chikkadevaraja Wadiyar of Mysore pressing from his expanding kingdom in Mysore. And Ekoji was caught right in the middle, holding Bengaluru from his seat in Tanjavur. Now, let's talk about all these pressures, one at a time. Ekoji Bhonsle ascended to Bengaluru's Jagir in 1664. Now, his brother, Sambhaji, who was the heir apparent, had died in 1653 under suspicious circumstances, and the family believed that the Bijapur general Afzal Khan was responsible. And in the last episode, we saw how Shivaji extracted his revenge on Afzal Khan. Ekoji was an ambitious man in his own right. In 1674, the Sultan of Bijapur had ordered him to intervene in a war between the Nayakas of Madurai and Tanjavur. Ekoji went south, defeated the Nayaka of Madurai, marched into Tanjavur, and then there was a dispute over the non-payment of campaign costs that Tanjavur was supposed to give him. So, Ekoji simply declared himself the independent Maharaja of Tanjavur. He founded the Maratha Bhonsle family of Tanjavur, and to this day there exists a visible bilingual community, the Tanjavur Marathis. There is also a pleasing piece of culinary trivia over here, and that is sambar, the South Indian staple consumed so many homes in one form or the other, and that is said to have been named for Ekoji's nephew Sambhaji during this period. Now, it might not be true at all, but it is one of those interesting stories, quite plausible, an urban legend nonetheless. It was in 1675 that Ekoji had permanently shifted his capital from Bengaluru to Tanjavur after this particular campaign. Now, he still governed Bengaluru. Bengaluru and all the 12 Hublis were still his Jagir, but he ruled it from a distance. And that distance was about to matter enormously because in the same year, 1674, far to the north, Shivaji had crowned himself Chhatrapati at Raigad, formally asserting sovereign Maratha kingship. And with that sovereignty came ambition. Shivaji, like many others, looked south at the ancestral Bhonsle domains, and he sought territory that in his view belonged to the Maratha crown. They were his father's, and not to a brother who had gone off and made himself king of Tanjavur. So in 1776, Shivaji launched what is now known in history as the Dakshina Digvijay, his southern campaign. Shivaji's objectives were to bring the southern Maratha holdings under his own kingship and to target the remnants of Bijapur's authority in the south, and his target was Bengaluru. So the campaign placed him directly in a collision course with his brother Ekoji. The relationship between the two brothers was strained from the outset, and not merely because of territorial ambition. Shivaji had claimed authority by right of kingship. Ekoji derived his authority from his inheritance from his father and his vassalship with Bijapur. Shivaji did not recognize the southern domain as any kind of an independent inheritance. From his perspective, Ekoji was not a parallel ruler but a subordinate, whose authority had derived from a since superseded Bijapur. Ekoji predictably saw things his own way. He had ruled the south for over a decade without any interference, his brother before him, his father before them. He was suspicious of his brother's grand ambitions. He was also hesitant to abandon his status as a Bijapuri vassal because that gave him political legitimacy that Shivaji's new sovereignty could not override just the way he wanted. So in July 1677, the two brothers met on the banks of the Kolidam River, the mouth of the Kaveri. This was their first meeting since their father's death. It was initially fraternal and cordial, and then the actual negotiations began and things began to harden. At one point in time, the situation got so tense that Shivaji would not let Ekoji leave until they had a resolution that he could accept, and Ekoji, faced with that pressure, needed to get the hell out. So he created a diversion, jumped into the river, climbed into a waiting catamaran, and spirited himself back across the river to his own camp. When Ekoji fled, the negotiations turned into open conflict. It was battle. A French priest in the area, François Martin, who happened to be in the vicinity and privy to all the events, described what followed not as a series of skirmishes, but as a bloody battle in which many were killed. In the aftermath of this battle, Shivaji took possession of a significant portion of the region. Bengaluru, Kolar, Ballapura, Sira, Sidlagatta, and Kopal, they were all among the territories that he had acquired. And Ekoji was left with Tanjavur and its immediate surroundings. Feeling the full weight of this loss, having fought his own brother and lost, Ekoji was very dispirited. He contemplated giving up everything and becoming a sannyasi. So he wrote a letter to his brother Shivaji, telling him of this decision. And Shivaji replied with a rather affectionate letter, urging his brother not to renounce the world. That tone of that letter, by all accounts, is genuinely warm. Whatever had passed between them on the battlefield, the fraternal bond had not broken entirely. There were negotiations and discussions between the ambassadors, the representatives of Ekoji and Shivaji, and a settlement followed. And in this settlement, there was one detail about Bengaluru that is remarkably interesting. Shivaji assigned the revenues of Bengaluru and the neighboring stations of Hoskote and Sidlagatta to not any general or administrator or Ekoji himself, but to Ekoji's wife, Deepabai. The revenue, the treaty specified, it is said, was for her Choli Bangdi. Now that word, Choli Bangdi, literally means blouse and bangles. And it is an old Marathi expression for personal pocket money, basic female haberdashery, as the book puts it. But think about what just happened. Bengaluru, a city yielding by then about 2 lakhs in revenue, which Shivaji estimated could yield about 5 lakhs under proper administration, had been assigned entirely as pocket money to Ekoji's wife. The trivialization was deliberate. It separated management from income and authority from revenue in a way that was highly unusual. Ekoji would continue to manage the villages, but all the money would go to Deepabai. It was in effect a way of keeping the arrangement in place while signaling to everyone that Bengaluru had been reduced in political significance to a little more of worth than the pocket money of a queen for blouse and bangles. The city that had been the jewel of the Bhonsle Jagir, the seat of Shahaji Bhonsle's court, the venue of Shivaji's own wedding, was now someone's pocket money. And now for a commercial break, and when I'm back, let's take a look at what happened after the death of Shivaji.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Chhatrapati Shivaji died in April 1680, and with his death, the last possibility of the southern Maratha domains being reorganized under some kind of a central command disappeared. Bengaluru technically remained in Maratha possession, but it now sat under a field of rivals that no longer recognized that there was anything of a stable hierarchy. Ekoji held it from Tanjavur. His nephew, Sambhaji, who was Shivaji's son, he held the northern areas. The arrangement between them over the southern areas was uneasy, unresolved, and dependent on the goodwill of men who were under pressure from every single direction, specifically the north, because from there, Aurangzeb was coming. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb had been watching the Deccan for decades. As a young man of 17, he was the Subedar of the Deccan, and this was in 1636, and this was the same year that his father had signed a treaty with Bijapur that created Bijapur's ambitions towards the south and then specifically to Bengaluru. Aurangzeb had governed the Deccan twice. He knew from close range how authority in the south depended less on formal sovereignty than on the ability of local commanders to hold ground, and he concluded that the Deccan was not a problem that could be solved through half measures. So when he became emperor in 1659, the question of the Deccan passed decisively into his hands. But the transformation was not immediate. For more than 2 decades, his imperial attention remained divided. But the decisive shift came in 1681 when Aurangzeb moved south in person, following the rebellion of his son, the Prince Akbar. His personal presence in the Deccan, then after that, remained constant for the rest of Aurangzeb's life, 26 years until his death in 1707 at Aurangabad. Aurangzeb's decision to resettle in the south was one of the great strategic miscalculations of Indian history. It allowed him to extinguish the sultanates, the old Bahmani sultanates and the ones that survived. But it left the northern empire to drift and eventually fracture. Aurangzeb had won the Deccan, but he had lost India. As for Bengaluru, the immediate consequence came in September 1686 when Aurangzeb had completed the Mughal conquest of Bijapur. The Adil Shahi dynasty, which had owned Bengaluru since 1638, which then had been granted to Shahaji, which had proved the legal and fiscal envelope within which the Marathi Jagir had operated for nearly half a century, was extinguished and it was gone. And that was the last we hear of Bijapur, the southern power that impacted so much of our history. The envelope disappeared. The framework that had sustained older arrangements vanished without being replaced with a new one. Bengaluru, once again in its history, perched 3,000 feet above sea level, was now completely exposed. Ekoji seated in Tanjavur lacked the capacity and maybe even the incentive to mount any kind of a decisive defense of a city which was more than 300 kilometers away from him. His authority over Bengaluru had become nominal anyway. The fort required constant provisioning, the garrison required pay, the countryside had to be kept protective under conditions of repeated cavalry movement, protected and made sure that the taxes were collected and, importantly, remitted to the kingdom. What had once been a great prize now was no more than an expensive liability. 3 powers now converged on the city simultaneously to take it. Aurangzeb General Qasim Khan was ordered to take Bengaluru, quote, at any cost. Shivaji's son and Ekoji's nephew Sambhaji dispatched 12,000 cavalry under Keshav Pingle and Santaji Ghorpade to secure their ancestral Jagir. Chikkadevaraja Wadiyar of Mysore had been watching, building and consolidating for years. He made no secrets of his designs on a city that was a natural strategic objective for any powers seeking to dominate the plateau. And Ekoji, caught inside the fort with all 3 powers closing in, made the only rational decision available. He sent a vakil, an emissary, to Chikkadevaraja with an offer to sell Bengaluru to him. The negotiations had by some accounts already been underway for some time. Mark Wilkes, the historian, describes them as having been a matter of notoriety. The agreed price was only 300,000 gold varahas. And this is the famous tale of how Bengaluru was sold for 3 lakh rupees. But 3 lakh gold varahas was significantly more. In terms of gold weight, it translated to roughly 1 ton of gold. And in late 2025 bullion terms, that would have been worth something like 1,500 crore rupees. For that price, Bengaluru, its fort, and all 12 Hublis passed, or were about to pass, to Mysore for a price of 3 lakh varahas. But just before the financial part of the transaction could be consummated, Qasim Khan arrived and he simply took the fort and he took the city, and the Mughal flag went up over the ramparts. And now Bengaluru technically was under Mughal rule. Days later, the Maratha cavalry under Santaji Ghorpade arrived at the city gates. He found the city gates closed, and looking up, he found the Mughal flag flying over it. He decided it was too late to assault, and unwilling to delay their move towards the campaign in Jinji, which was underway, the Marathas withdrew and galloped away. The story doesn't end there. Qasim Khan, having taken the fort, looked at what he had won, and he made his own calculation. He didn't have the manpower to garrison it properly, and the strategic objective that Aurangzeb cared about, which was contain Maratha power, secure the whole south, could just as well be achieved with a friendly Mysore king on the plateau as with a Mughal garrison. So he convinced Aurangzeb to sell Bengaluru to Chikkadevaraja at the price already agreed upon. Ekoji had been the seller until Qasim Khan had interrupted the sale by kicking Ekoji out and taking over Bengaluru for himself. Therefore, he became the seller at the same price to the same buyer. The Maratha years in Bengaluru, established in 1638, sustained for nearly half a century. It ended not in conquest, not in glory, but in sheer exhaustion. The city passed intact and valuable into the hands now of one power in this contest that had always been prepared to convert possession into performance: Mysore. And with that, Bengaluru began yet another chapter. The Kempe Gowdas under the Vijayanagara kings had built it. The Marathas under the Bijapur sultans had inherited it, fought over it, and assigned it as pocket money to one of the queens. And finally, they wanted to sell it. And then Qasim Khan invaded it, and the Mughals now owned Bengaluru, and they simply consummated the sale. Now, the Wadiyars of Mysore owned it, and they intended to keep it. And keep it they did. What they did with it is where we will go next. In episode 85, we will cover the Third Battle of Bengaluru in 1687 and the complicated, contested accounts of exactly what happened in those critical days when the Mughal flag flew briefly over the fort. How briefly? Was it days or was it years? All that is coming up right behind this one. Keep a close watch and I'll see you soon. I am Ramjee Chandran and this is the history of Bangalore.